Having guests come to stay, especially back in history, it was a really big deal, and you treated your guests with the best that you had. Maybe going out and hunting a deer and bringing back that fresh meat, you would have celebrated with your guests. And that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna take this cast iron skillet, we're gonna go out to the fire, and we are gonna cook venison over the coals. But we're not gonna cook just any slice of venison, because when you got a fresh deer back in the day, odds are a lot of it had to be preserved for later. You weren't gonna eat all that venison in one sitting. But there's one cut you absolutely would have eaten fresh right away, and that was the backstraps. But venison backstraps, they're not gonna go a long way. There's only a little bit to go around. So with company coming today, we have friends from far away visiting, we are going to give them our best. A real taste of Montana, and cooking it this way, a real taste of history. So let's go cook venison backstraps over the coals of the fire. This late 1800s original homestead cabin has seen a lot of life. And today, it's gonna be bustling with lots of people, friends from long ago and far away. I like to think of what a joy it would have been. I mean, just imagine if you were living out here as a homesteader back in the day, and your friends and family made that long journey out to visit. What pure joy you would have felt. Your isolation was very real, and a celebration around the open fire would have been almost a dream. Venison would have been a special treat in 1880s Montana, and it's about to be a special treat today. But this dinner is going to take the whole family pitching in.
Oh, wow.
We've even got Nana's sourdough. Hospitality is one of those country virtues that lives on today. But back in history, it was so much more serious. People genuinely needed each other, and the distances between homes was very great, to the point where injury or death was real if you didn't make it in time. This account paints a heck of a picture. Ellinore Pruitt Stewart recounts how they were stuck in a snowstorm and, quote, more dead than alive, we scrambled out, cold, stiffened, and hungry. Carlotta Juanita threw open the low, wide door and we stumbled into comfort. She hastened to help us with our wraps and piled more wood on the open fire, busying herself to make us welcome and comfortable. The floor was of dirt, and they had the largest fireplace I've ever seen with the widest, cleanest hearth where they did all their cooking. All their furniture was homemade, and on a low bench near the door were 3 water jugs, which I'm sure were handmade. Supper was prepared, simmering, and smoking on the hearth. As soon as the men came in, Carlotta Juanita put it on the table, which was of bare cloth. I can't say that I really like Mexican bread, but they certainly know how to cook meat. They had a most wonderful pot roast with potatoes and corn dumplings. The roast had been slashed in pieces and small bits of garlic, pepper, bacon, and parsley inserted. She served a queer Mexican pie, made of dried buffalo berries, stewed and made very sweet. She had peculiar coffee with goat's milk in it. I took mine without the milk, but I couldn't make up my mind that I liked the coffee. We sat around the fire drinking it. The men bade us good night, and we lost no time in settling ourselves to rest. Luckily, we had plenty of blankets. So, hospitality back in the day was often measured by the jar. Whether it was raspberry preserves, pickles, chutney, things that you could make in your little homestead cabin on your cook stove using your own labor. You went out, you picked the berries, you filtered the honey, you melted down the beeswax. These little jars symbolized hours of your time and labor and knowledge. So to give this to a friend or a family member, it was a real symbol of love. And last week in the cabin, we spent day after day making 1800s raspberry preserves. And today, we're gonna check on how everything turned out once it cooled. And then I think we're gonna give some to friends and family. Because this isn't just any raspberry jam. This is 1800s raspberry jam. And the flavor of the honey and the beeswax melted down over it is gonna change how everything tastes. So I'm curious what our family members are gonna think. I'm curious if other people are gonna like this as much as the kids and I did. It definitely is different. But let's go check on it to see if everything sealed the way it really needed to. Now before we fiddle with this jam, there's a job to do. This venison had to get marinating all night because a bit of sweetness and saltiness is the key to great venison. And old cookbooks, they knew it too. Whenever I've found an old recipe for venison, I bet 2/3 of the time it calls specifically for currant jelly. This was absolutely the preferred flavor of the 1800s when it comes to wild meat. Now, why sweetness? Well, there's a certain magic that happens to wild game when that combination is made. For us here today, we're marinating in a sweet apple cider vinegar that we made from apples right here on the ranch. And then a splash of imported red wine vinegar gives that bitterness, some Worcestershire, and rich beef stock. We want this meat to soak in it overnight. Then a few sprigs of herbs from the garden are the final touch. We've managed to overwinter our rosemary bush indoors for now year after year, and I suspect many a homesteader tried to do that too. A lot of herbs just won't stay alive through winter, but any available herbs would help this dish. Whether it was oregano, sage, any of the hardy herbs, you would want to put them in. Venison sometimes gets a reputation for being gamey. I've had gamey venison, it is a real thing. Antelope can be even worse if they've run for some distance before falling. It's just the nature of hunting. But of all the cuts, backstraps are the ones you have to do the least to. They are perfect in and of themselves. They're just so special. And because today's meat was hunted well and quickly by our good friend Pat, I know that we're in for a treat. But I'll be honest, I didn't know how good we had it until the end. So with hot coals finally ready over the fire, it's a quick sear for this venison and we'll have a meal, which is good because a lot of people are arriving. Back in the day, and even still right now in the modern world, getting a deer and bringing home fresh venison, that was something to celebrate. But one cut, especially, you would absolutely have eaten fresh. It is such a special piece of meat. I'm sure fights ensued over who would get to eat it. It's proof of real neighborliness that our friends Pat and Katie would give us this cut to cook today. I'm gonna cook up this special cut over the coals of the campfire in our cast iron skillet, and I think everyone's going to get just a little piece. Because although this isn't big enough to feed the whole family, it's enough to give everyone a real flavor of Montana and of history. So hospitality was a big thing in history. No matter how little you had, even if you were living off the scrapings of your flour barrel, you prepared the best you had for your guests. Why did people do this? It doesn't really make much survival sense, but it's biblical. Clothe the naked, feed the hungry, shelter the weary traveler. We're talking corporal alms deeds here, and that would have been preached from the pulpit across this nation. And the God-fearing people who headed out across the prairies into certain danger with their children and everything they owned in this world, yeah, their faith was no small point to them. Sharing what little you had was a defining feature of small cabin life. And when a neighbor or a stranger stumbled upon your cabin, you may have been a bit wary, but you cooked up extra food and you were expected to a certain social standard to feed him until he was no longer hungry and to give him a bed to sleep in. Often your bed. We're talking a level of hospitality above what we would do today. Now, in case I'm drifting into making it sound like the majority of people out here were good, God-fearing folk, they weren't. In fact, our resident historian Michael was quick to point out that in the 1860s, 1870s Montana, there wouldn't have been a woman to be found out here. This was lawless, war-torn territory without a shred of food on it. And the men who roamed it were often very rough, not the sort you wanted to stumble upon asking for a meal. My great-grandmother Grace once rode in a stagecoach with Wyatt Earp, and her memory of it was to say, and I quote, "He was the meanest SOB I ever met." So for all the romance of the Wild West, there were some bad guys out there. Even the good guys were often bad guys. Danger lurked out here, and there's a darker story from the bundle of Ellinore Pruitt Stewart's preserved Homesteader letters that tells of it. It talks of the night that horse thieves came through their camp. Ellinore and her baby were tucked under blankets by the outdoor campfire, and a bold one of the thieves crawled into the blankets of one of the ranch hands, who awoke to find the back of his shirt covered in blood from the injured vigilante. The sheriff soon rode up and questioned him, but the horse thieves had escaped in the night, despite being surrounded by the sheriff, the ranch hands, and a posse. Their bold decision to climb into the bedrolls and pretend to be one of the crew proved pretty ingenious. But it also shows that these lands out here were wild, and they were wild well into the 1900s. So when this homestead was built in the 1880s, 90s, the feminine touch of cooking a full meal and hosting guests, well, that was the first generation of it, aside from the cultural ways of the native peoples from long before, which I can't speak much to, but I'm sure there were some similar values for guests and some very different values. So you had lawless men of the Wild West on the one hand. Yes, the harsh, newly opened lands brought out great evil in some. But on the other hand, you had a hard swing towards the religious, and care for your neighbor has been a virtue taken seriously throughout history. How many times in the Bible does a widow or a family share their last scrapings of flour and oil to make bread for some strange visitor? This is ancient stuff. But back to the reality of eating this venison and all the feast of foods that we had in the cabin, there was sourdough bread baked by my mother, drinks, sausages, and all sorts of foods that we had in the cabin, and all sorts of side dishes brought out to stretch the meal, because we had a lot of people here. But this all really circles back to that venison. And in the heat of the fire, the shouting of children, and all the socializing, I couldn't use words to describe it. But oh my goodness, everyone said it was the best meat they had ever had. I couldn't believe the complete lack of gaminess, not even an inkling. And not overwhelmed by any sauces or the marinade, just that subtle sweetness and the right amount of salt. I bet a thin glaze of jelly or jam over the top would have added a perfect 1800s twist. But speaking of that jam, we need to see if our moonshine and beeswax preservation methods that we tried last week are holding. I mean, this is what kept your food for winter, back before canning as we know it in the modern world came to exist out here on the plains. We simmered down a batch of raspberries with sugar and honey, and then we capped the hot jars with two old methods. One done with wax, the other with moonshine. But are they going to hold? All right, it's the early morning. I came out here to do some work, and we've had a bunch of rain in July, which is really unusual. But I waded through all the mud puddles, and I came out here because I have to check on how this jam has done. It's actually been 2 days since we poured it and then capped everything with wax, and on some of these we used paper dipped in alcohol. So this is kind of the big reveal. How has the wax set up, and do I see any mold or anything getting into the ones with the alcohol paper? So far, everything looks stable. I don't see any mold, but this is pretty early days. One thing I'm not loving is that beeswax, as it fully hardened, did shrink a little bit. So around the edge, it's maybe a 32nd of an inch of a gap between the wax and the jar. That could be trouble. That could be trouble. I don't know how that's gonna play out. That little crack around the edge, that is the perfect place for mold to form, air to get into the jam. It probably would have been smart to come back maybe 6 hours later and pour one more time. And I think that would get the job done. Okay, what about the paper dipped in alcohol? In case you think this is totally nuts, or maybe I've made up this method, I dug up a clip of a wonderful British gardener who many of you may know, Monty Don. It's from an old show called Fork to Fork, where his family preserves their damson jam, which is a sort of plum jam, and they use this exact paper method. No canning, no refrigeration. And from what I understand, this is still common practice in England. It's wild to me, but here it is, straight out of history. And it's the same thing we did in this cabin. What a cool experiment.
It's wonderful with lamb, pies, or strong cheese. We also always have it with our Christmas goose. It keeps for ages and looks almost ornamental on a kitchen shelf.
Some of these jars we've covered with fabric and string, and again, the goal of that is to keep out dust and dirt and flies and all the things that are around when you have a living house and a living place out in the fields. So I'm gonna take these, I'm gonna put some of them in a cool place, some of them in a refrigerator, and we're gonna watch this experiment because I don't know what's gonna happen, but I do know that this was the way you could store food for long periods of time without water bath canning, without pressure canning. This is how you did it. But of course, like so many skills, the method might be somewhat simple, but the devil's in the details. It's knowing how much wax to pour, whether or not you should do that second pouring to just put that little bit extra. That's the difference between success and failure. And we used to learn all those skills from our mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers, but now we're getting these generation gaps where none of us really remember how to do it. Our great-grandparents knew, but that knowledge has slowly drifted away. So it comes down to relearning from scratch, and that usually involves trial and error. We'll see. I'm here for the experiment.
Thanks for cooking inside and outside of the cabin with us. Hope to see you next Saturday.
Not after that, but a few years later, I started going to church every Sunday.
And he goes every
And I do. I'm Mr. 7 o'clock Mass.